The universe did not scream when it tore apart. It hummed. That was the last thing Captain Steve Rogers registered before the blinding blue light of the Tesseract collapsed into a singularity, dragging him from the frozen fuselage of the Valkyrie and hurling him through the membrane of reality itself. There was no sensation of cold, no biting wind of the Arctic, only a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and the sickening lurch of gravity shifting on a cosmic axis. Then, the ground rushed up to meet him. Impact. Steve slammed into deep, viscous mud, the breath driven from his lungs in a sharp gasp. The landing wasn't graceful. It was a brutal collision of vibranium and biology against wet earth. He rolled instinctively, years of combat drills overriding the disorientation, and came up in a crouch, his shield raised. He expected the freezing bite of the polar wind or the heat of the Red Skull's energy weapons. Instead, he tasted rain. Warm, torrential rain that smelled of ozone and sulfur. He wasn't in the Arctic. He was in a trench. The sky above was a bruised purple, choked with low-hanging clouds that flashed with rhythmic, silent lightning, but the thunder that followed wasn't natural. It was the staccato rhythm of artillery. Red bolts of energy, plasma, his tactical mind supplied, screamed overhead, sizzling as they evaporated the raindrops. "Man down! Man down! We're losing the flank!" The voice was distorted, synthesized through a helmet filter, but the panic in it was universally human. Steve wiped the mud from his goggles, his eyes adjusting to the chaotic gloom. 50 yards ahead, a line of soldiers in pristine white armor, filthy now, caked in gray muck, were pinned down behind a crumbling Duracrete embankment. They were firing blue energy beams from carbines, desperate suppression fire that was doing little to halt the advancing wall of metal. And it was a wall. Emerging from the mist wasn't the Wehrmacht, it wasn't Hydra, it was an army of skeletons. Tall, beige-colored machines with elongated heads and spindly limbs marched in terrifying lockstep, their metal feet splashing through the puddles in perfect unison. They didn't take cover. They didn't flinch. They simply walked forward, firing red plasma from wrist-mounted blasters with mechanical precision. "What in the name of?" Steve muttered, the sheer scale of the mechanized infantry causing a moment of pause. A massive explosion rocked the embankment. One of the white-armored soldiers was thrown backward, his chest plate scorched black. The line was breaking. The machines were pushing through the gap, their emotionless advance threatening to overrun the surviving men. Steve didn't know where he was, he didn't know who these soldiers were, but he knew a losing battle when he saw one, and he knew bullies, flesh or metal, didn't get to win on his watch. He tightened the straps on his left arm. The weight of the shield was the only familiar anchor in a world gone mad. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Steve Rogers launched himself out of the crater. He moved with a speed that defied the sucking mud. His boots found traction where there should have been none. He didn't run away from the fire. He sprinted parallel to the trench line, drawing the attention of the lead machines. "Hey!" Steve shouted, his voice booing over the sound of the rain. "Over here!" 3 of the skeletal droids turned their heads with a mechanical whir. Their targeting computers processed the anomaly, a humanoid male, unarmored, wearing blue primitive distinctives, carrying a circular alloy disc. Threat level, negligible. They fired. Steve didn't slow down. He dipped his shoulder, bringing the star-spangled shield up. Thrum hiss. The plasma bolts didn't ricochet with the sharp ping of lead bullets. They impacted the vibranium with a sizzling hiss. The kinetic energy absorbed and dispersed instantly by the alien metal. The shield didn't even vibrate. It hungered for the energy. Steve closed the distance. 30 yards. 10 yards. He leapt, tucking his knees to his chest and uncoiled like a spring. The edge of the shield led the way. He smashed into the center droid, the vibranium biting through the beige metal neck like it was balsa wood. The droid's head went spinning into the mud, sparks showering the trench. Steve landed in a fluid roll, coming up behind the second droid. He didn't have a gun, but he didn't need one. He drove a gloved fist into the machine's spinal strut. Super soldier strength met mass-produced manufacturing. The metal crumbled, and the droid collapsed into a heap of twitching limbs. The third droid attempted to swivel, its blaster arm raising point blank. Steve kicked the blaster arm aside, shattering the joint, and slammed the edge of his shield downward, cleaving the machine from shoulder to hip. Silence. For exactly 1 second. Then, the entire battlefield seemed to pivot towards him. "Focus fire on Sector 4. New target identified," a harsh, metallic voice screeched from the fog. Steve turned to see the white-armored soldiers staring at him. Their helmets were T-visioned, impassive, but their body language screamed confusion. They had stopped firing, stunned by the sight of a man in blue fabric dismantling war machines with a frisbee. "Don't just stand there," Steve roared, pointing towards the breach he had just cleared. "Fill that gap! Move!" The command tone was universal. It cut through the shock. The soldier closest to him, a sergeant, judging by the olive markings on his armor, snapped out of his trance. "You heard him," the sergeant barked, his voice sounding oddly identical to the trooper who had shouted earlier. "Move up! Oryx squad, suppressive fire. Bacta, check on the wounded." The soldiers surged forward, their discipline snapping back into place. Blue bolts hammered the droid ranks, now effective again thanks to the distraction Steve had provided. Steve fell in line beside the sergeant, raising his shield to cover the man as he reloaded his energy weapon. "Thanks for the assist, citizen, but you're in a live fire zone. Where's your evac?" "My ride crashed," Steve said grimly, scanning the misty horizon. More shapes are emerging, larger ones, bulky, gray-plated droids with blasters built into their arms, super battle droids. "What is the alloy?" the sergeant asked, his words barely audible above the natural thunder. "It's one of a kind," Steve said, shifting his grip. He looked at the advancing super battle droids. There were dozens of them. The clone squad was low on ammo, exhausted, and terrified. They needed more than a shield. They needed a leader. Steve Rogers looked at the sergeant. "What's your name, son?" "CT-4422, Sergeant Banks, sir." "All right, Banks," Steve said, his voice calm, steady, anchoring the panic around them. "I'm Captain Rogers. We're not retreating. If we fall back, they take the trench. If they take the trench, they flank your general. We hold here." Banks hesitated. "Sir, those represent heavy infantry. We don't have the ordnance." Steve tightened his shield strap again. His eyes were hard, blue steel. "I've fought tanks with less," Steve said. "Have your men focus fire on the joints, knees, and elbows. I'll draw their attention." "You'll draw their fire? All of it?" Banks asked, incredulous. Steve smiled, a grim, determined expression that had rallied the Howling Commandos across half of Europe. "I can do this all day."
The mud of the battlefield churned under Steve's boots as he broke into a sprint, leaving the relative safety of the trench behind. To the droids, he was a statistical anomaly, a soft target charging into a kill zone without energy shielding or heavy ordnance. To Sergeant Banks and the remnants of RX Squad, he was a suicide runner. But to Steve Rogers, this was Tuesday. "Suppressing fire, now!" Steve roared, his voice cutting through the deluge. Banks didn't hesitate. "You heard the captain. Light him up." Blue bolts screamed past Steve, peppering the thick gray plating of the advancing super battle droids. The B-2s halted their plodding march, their wrist blasters swiveling to address the incoming fire. This was the window Steve needed. He didn't run in a straight line. He zigzagged, moving with a velocity that human legs shouldn't possess in shin-deep sludge. The B-2s tracked him, their targeting computers calculating lead times, but Steve was faster than their algorithms. He raised the shield just as a barrage of red plasma erupted from the droid line. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The impacts jarred his shoulder, but he leaned into the kinetic energy, using the momentum to launch himself into a slide. He came in low, beneath the firing arc of the lead B-2. With a guttural shout, he uppercutted the shield's edge into the droid's midsection. The vibranium didn't just dent the metal, it sheared through the sensory wiring and gyro stabilizers. The massive droid folded in half with a shriek of tearing steel. Steve didn't stop. He pivoted, grabbing the falling droid's arm and twisting it, using the wreck as a temporary barrier against its squadmate. Plasma scorched the dead droid's chassis as Steve wound up and hurled the shield. It flew like a disk of vengeful light. It struck the second B-2 in the neck, ricocheted off its carapace to smash the knee joint of a third, and banked off a ruined Duracrete pillar to return to Steve's outstretched hand. The magnetics in his gauntlet snapped it in place with a satisfying clack. "Forward," Steve commanded, waving Banks's squad up. "Don't let them regroup. Push the flank." 50 meters back, on a ridge overlooking the chaotic melee, a pair of macro binoculars lowered to reveal a T-visored helmet painted with distinctive blue markings. Captain Rex, commander of the 501st, had seen a lot of things in this war. He had seen Jedi generals leap hundreds of feet into the air. He had seen General Skywalker crush droids with his mind. He had seen lightsabers cut through blast doors. But he had never seen a nat-born, a natural-born human without the Force, move like that. "Captain," a trooper next to him said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Are you seeing this? Who is that guy? He's moving faster than an ARC trooper." Rex handed the macros to the trooper, Jesse. "I see him. No lightsaber, no armor, just a shield and... is that spandex uniform?" "He's tearing them apart, sir. He just took out a heavy patrol with a metal plate." Rex checked his tactical display. The sector Banks was holding had been written off 10 minutes ago. Command had ordered a tactical withdrawal to preserve the artillery line. But the line wasn't withdrawing. It was advancing. "Come on," Rex said, unholstering his dual DC-17 hand blasters. "If a civilian is doing our job for us, we're never going to hear the end of it." Down in the mud, the battle had devolved into a brawl. Steve was in his element. The super soldier serum eliminated the fatigue toxins flooding his muscles, allowing him to fight with the same intensity he had at the start. He ducked a clumsy swing from a B-2, drove his knee into its chest, and finished it with a shield bash to the faceplate. But there were too many of them. A fresh wave of commando droids, lithe, acrobatic, and deadly, flipped over the wreckage of an ATE Walker, vibro swords drawn. They were faster than the B-2s, designed to kill Jedi. "Watch your six," Banks screamed. Steve turned, raising his shield just as a vibro sword sparked against the star. The commando droid was strong, its servos whining as it pushed the blade down, trying to leverage around the defense. Steve grit his teeth, his boots sliding in the muck. Suddenly, 2 rapid blue bolts struck the droid's head, blowing its photoreceptors apart. The machine crumpled. Steve looked up to see a clone trooper in blue striped armor, pauldron on his shoulder, dual pistols in hand, striding through the rain with practiced lethality. Behind him, a full squad of elite troopers fanned out, their aim precise and deadly. "Nice shot," Steve called, shoving the dead droid away. "You look like you could use a hand," the newcomer said, scanning the perimeter. "I'm Captain Rex, 501st. Steve straightened up, wiping rain from his eyes. He assessed Rex instantly. Confident, competent, dangerous. A soldier's soldier. "Captain Rogers," Steve replied, offering a nod. "Appreciate the assist, Rex. These ones are quicker than the walking trash." Rex paused, looking at the vibranium shield, then at the destruction Steve had left behind. He saw the bodies of droids, not sliced by plasma, but battered by blunt force trauma. It was brutal, visceral work. "Rogers?" Rex asked, the name unfamiliar. "Are you with Republic Intelligence or a Jedi Shadow?" "Neither," Steve said, retrieving his shield. "Just a guy from Brooklyn who doesn't like bullies." Rex didn't know where Brooklyn was, but he understood the sentiment. He looked at Banks and the surviving members of RX Squad. They were battered, their armor scorched, but they were standing tall. They were looking at Rogers not with the distant reverence they saved for Jedi, but with the kinship of men who had bled in the same mud. "Sir," Banks interjected, stepping forward, Captain Rogers rallied us when the line broke. He took point against heavy fire to give us a reload window. He fights like one of us." That was the highest compliment a clone could give. Rex looked at Rogers with new eyes. A nat-born who didn't hide behind the clones? Who took point? "Well, Captain Rogers," Rex said, holstering one blaster, "the sector isn't clear yet. We've got a battalion of droidecas rolling up the center. Jedi General Skywalker is engaging them, but he's pinned down by sniper fire." Steve adjusted his gloves. "Snipers? High ground?" "Ridge to the east," Rex confirmed. "I can flush them out," Steve said, his tactical mind already mapping the terrain. "My shield can take the sniper shots better than your armor." Rex hesitated. This was unorthodox. Civilians didn't flank snipers. But then this man had just dismantled a B-2 squad with his bare hands. "I'll send Jesse and Hardcase with you," Rex offered. "No," Steve said firmly. "They'll slow me down, and the clankers will spot the white armor. I go alone. Keep the pressure on the front. Make them look at you, not me." Steve didn't wait for permission. He turned and sprinted toward the rocky incline to the east, moving with that impossible speed again, a blue blur against the gray rain. Rex watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his gut. It was respect, certainly, but something else, too. A question. "Rex," Jesse said, coming up beside him, "who is that guy?" "I don't know," Rex muttered, watching the first sniper on the ridge go flying off the ledge, courtesy of a flying metal disc. "Command is hailing us," Jesse continued, tapping his helmet. "General Kenobi wants a sitrep. He sensed a disturbance in the battle." Rex watched as another sniper fell. The disturbance was currently clearing the high ground with a right hook that could crack a helmet. "Tell the general the line is holding," Rex said, a grin hidden beneath his helmet, "and tell him we found a stray."
The rain had ceased, leaving the battlefield shrouded in a heavy, clinging mist that smelled of wet ash and scorched ozone. The silence that followed the artillery barrage was almost louder than the explosions themselves, a hollow, ringing quiet, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the mechanical hiss of medical droids. Steve Rogers did not sit down. He did not seek out a command tent or a warm ration pack. He was knee-deep in a mud-filled crater, his shield strapped to his back, heaving a slab of duracrete off the pinned leg of a trooper. "Easy, son," Steve grunted, the veins in his neck bulging as he lifted the 2-ton debris with a strain that made the nearby clones stop and stare. "I've got it. Pull him clear." Two medics scrambled into the hole, dragging their comrade out by his harness. They looked up at Steve with wide, T-visored eyes, mumbling thanks that were swallowed by the sheer absurdity of what they were witnessing. A man, a normal, unarmored man, was lifting debris that would usually require a walker. "Captain," a voice called out from the ridge above. Steve lowered the slab gently, careful not to cause a tremor that might collapse the trench wall, and wiped his muddy hands on his trousers. He looked up to see Captain Rex standing beside two newcomers. They were different. Even from a distance, Steve could feel the shift in the air. One wore dark robes over black leather, his hair wild and his presence radiating a restless, stormy energy. The other was older, bearded, composed, wrapped in beige tunics that seemed impractical for mud, yet remained irritatingly pristine. Steve climbed out of the crater, his boots heavy with the planet's soil. He approached them, his posture straightening instinctively into attention, though he didn't salute. He didn't know who these men were, but he recognized officers when he saw them. "So," the younger one said, crossing his arms. He looked Steve up and down, his gaze lingering on the star on Steve's chest and the vibranium shield. "Rex tells me you took out 3 B-2 squads and a sniper nest. Alone." "I had help," Steve said, nodding toward the clones clearing the field. "Your men held the line. I just cleared the path." The older man stroked his beard, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read fine print on a distant sign. "Modesty is a rare trait in mercenaries," he observed, his voice cultured and calm. "I am General Obi-Wan Kenobi. This is General Anakin Skywalker. We speak for the Republic forces in the sector." "General," Steve repeated, testing the word. It fit the older man. It seemed too heavy for the younger one. I'm Captain Steve Rogers, and I'm not a mercenary. I don't fight for money. Then who do you fight for? Anakin asked, stepping closer. The challenge in his voice was palpable. He was used to being the most powerful entity in any room. Steve's physical presence, broad-shouldered, calm, and utterly unimpressed, seemed to irritate him. I fight for the men next to me, Steve replied, evenly. And right now, that seems to be these soldiers. Though I have to ask, General, why are they wearing white armor in a mud environment? It's a tactical nightmare. Rex stuffled a cough behind his helmet. Anakin blinked, thrown off balance by the practical critique. They are clone troopers, Obi-Wan interjected smoothly, stepping between them. They are bred for combat efficiency, Captain. Their armor is standard issue across the galaxy. Bred? Steve brow furrowed. The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. You mean they're conscripts? They are grown, Anakin said, defensively, in the cloning facilities on Camino. They serve the Republic from birth. It is their purpose. Steve looked at Rex, then back at the generals. The horror of it didn't register on their faces. To them, it was a fact of life. To Steve Rogers, a man who fought a war against a tyrant obsessed with genetic superiority and a master race, it was a gut punch. You breed men to die for you? Steve asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing its warmth. We lead them, Anakin snapped. We fight beside them. We die with them. But they don't get a choice, do they? Steve held Anakin's gaze. The air between them crackled. Careful, Captain, Anakin warned, his hand drifting unconsciously toward the metal cylinder on his belt. You are a guest on this battlefield. We are Jedi Knights. We are the guardians of peace and justice in the galaxy. Jedi, Steve said. Never heard of you, but where I come from, peace isn't built on the backs of slaves. The word slave hit Anakin like a physical blow. His eyes flashed, a dangerous yellow flicker buried deep in the blue. Obi-Wan stepped in immediately, sensing the volatility. He raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a calming gesture. Captain Rogers, you are clearly not from the system, perhaps not even this galaxy. I sense very little from you. Obi-Wan closed his eyes for a moment, reaching out with his feelings. He expected to find a connection. Every living thing resonated in the Force. But Steve Rogers was strange. He was there, vibrant with life and will, but he was quiet, muted, like a radio tuned to a frequency the Jedi couldn't quite catch. It wasn't the emptiness of a droid, it was a density, a solidity. You are not Force-sensitive, Obi-Wan concluded, opening his eyes with a frown. Yet Rex claims you moved faster than a droideca's targeting computer. I've had some enhancements, Steve said vaguely, but I'm just a kid from Brooklyn. Brooklyn, Obi-Wan mused. Is that in the Outer Rim? It's far away, Steve said. He looked around at the devastation. Look, General, I don't know your politics, I don't know this war, but I know soldiers. Your men are exhausted. They're running on fumes. You have them pushing a frontal assault against fortified machine positions. That's WWI-1 tactics with futuristic weapons. You're wasting lives. We are winning, Anakin insisted, though his anger had shifted to confusion. No one spoke to Jedi this way. Not senators, not admirals, and certainly not random strays in spandex. You're trading lives for ground, Steve corrected. There's a difference. I saw your casualty reports on the sergeant's datapad. You lost 40 men taking that ridge. I took it with 0 casualties. Anakin scoffed. You got lucky. Steve unclipped the shield from his back. He held it up, the vibranium surface marred by scorch marks, but structurally perfect. Luck doesn't stop plasma. Strategy does. If you want to take that refinery, you don't march in a line. You infiltrate. You use small unit tactics. You hit their supply lines. And you think you can teach us strategy? Anakin asked, amused now. I think I can help these men survive, Steve said. He turned to Rex. Captain, your squad mentioned a blockade on the South Pass. Yes, sir, Rex answered automatically, then caught himself. He glanced at Anakin. I mean, yes, heavy turrets. We can't get the ATTEs through. Steve looked back at the Jedi. Give me a squad. Just one. I'll open the pass. No frontal assault, no suicide charge. We do it my way. Obi-Wan studied Steve. He saw the tactical mind at work, the charisma that naturally drew the clones' attention. He saw a man that was dangerous, not because of a weapon, but because of an idea, that the clones were more than numbers. It was a dangerous thought for the Republic's stability, but right now, they needed that refinery. Anakin, Obi-Wan said softly, we are at a stalemate. If the captain fails, we are no worse off. Anakin crossed his arms, looking from Steve to Rex. He saw the way Rex stood a little straighter next to the stranger. Fine, Anakin said, his voice clipped. Take Oryx Squad, but if you get them killed, Rogers, you answer to me. Steve nodded, his expression grim. I always answer for my men, General. That's the job. Steve turned to Rex. Get them ready, Captain. We move in 10. As Steve walked away to inspect the squad's gear, Obi-Wan moved to Anakin's side. He is intense, Obi-Wan murmured. He's arrogant, Anakin countered, watching Steve check a trooper's blaster rifle with professional familiarity. And he's hiding something. No one's that fast without the Force. Perhaps, Obi-Wan said, watching the way the clones gravitated toward the man in the blue suit. But did you notice, Anakin? Notice what? For the first time in months, the clones aren't looking at us. They're looking at him. As the clones dispersed, spreading the story of the shield-bearer to anyone who would listen, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The reverence was palpable. But as Steve turned toward the command tent, the air grew colder. General Anakin Skywalker was waiting for him. The young Jedi stood with his arms crossed, his cloak billowing in the wind. Obi-Wan sat nearby on a crate, sipping tea with an expression of mild amusement, but Anakin looked like a storm cloud contained in leather and cloth. The refinery is secure, General, Steve reported, stopping a respectful distance away. We cut the power to their anti-air batteries. Your birds are clear to land. I saw the report, Anakin said, his voice flat. Fast work. Efficient. But, Steve prompted, hearing the unspoken critique. But reckless. Anakin stepped forward, the mud squelching under his boots. You went off comms for 10 minutes inside the ventilation system. If you had been caught, we wouldn't have known until they started executing hostages. We weren't caught, Steve said calmly, and we went off comms to avoid tripping their scanners. It was a calculated risk. You rely too much on calculation, Captain, Anakin snapped. War isn't math. It's chaos. And in chaos, you need power. You need the Force. You were lucky a droideka didn't corner you in those vents. Without a lightsaber, you'd be dead. Steve unslung his shield, holding it by the rim. I've faced worse than robots with shields, Captain. This holds up just fine. Anakin's eyes narrowed, focusing on the vibranium disc. He had sensed the strange void around Steve earlier, the lack of Force sensitivity, and it bothered him. It felt like an affront that a man could be this capable without the gift that made the Jedi special. Is that a challenge? Anakin asked, a dangerous smirk touching his lips. Anakin, Obi-Wan warned softly, setting down his tea. No, Master, Anakin said, unclipping the silver cylinder from his belt. The captain thinks his metal plate is equal to a Jedi's weapon. I think it's important we know the capabilities of our allies, for safety reasons. Steve looked at the lightsaber hilt, then at Anakin's face. He recognized the look. He had seen it on Tony Stark, on Thor, on reckless young soldiers trying to prove they were invincible. It was pride. Steve stepped back, clearing a circle in the mud. If you want to spar, General, just say so, but I don't pull my punches. Good, Anakin said. Snap hiss. The sapphire blade ignited with a hum that vibrated in Steve's chest. The blue light cast harsh shadows across the camp. Clones nearby stopped their repairs. Heads turned. A ring began to form instantly, white armor and muddy fatigues pressing in to see the General take on the stranger. Anakin didn't wait for a signal. He lunged. It was a probing strike, a horizontal slash meant to disarm, fast enough to blur the air. Steve didn't retreat. He stepped into the guard. He brought the shield up in a tight arc. Crack, hiss. Plasma met vibranium. The sound was agonizing, a shriek of energy trying to violate matter that refused to yield. Sparks cascaded like fireworks, illuminating the stunned faces of the 501st. The lightsaber didn't cut through. It bounced off. Anakin's eyes widened. He had expected the shield to shear in half, or at least heat up to the point of being dropped. Instead, the alloy absorbed the kinetic impact of the blow and dispersed the heat instantly. "Impossible," Anakin breathed. "Unique alloy," Steve grunted, shoving forward. The shield bash caught Anakin in the chest. It wasn't a damaging blow, Anakin rolled with it, but the indignity of being pushed back by a non-Force user ignited his temper. "Let's see how unique," Anakin growled. He attacked in earnest now. Form 5, Gemso, heavy, battering defenses designed to crush defenses. He rained blows down on Steve, overhead, side, thrust, overhead. Steve moved like water. The super soldier serum fired every neuron, allowing him to track the blade path. He angled the shield to deflect rather than block, letting the plasma slide off the rounded surface. Clang, hiss, spark. Steve was on the defensive, giving ground, his boots sliding in the mud. Anakin was faster, enhanced by the Force to speeds that made him a blur, but Steve was a master tactician. He was reading the pattern. Anakin overextended on a high strike. Steve dropped to one knee, the lightsaber passing inches above his head, singing the air. He spun, sweeping his leg. Anakin sensed it, of course. The Force warned him. He leapt over the sweep, flipping backward. But while he was in the air, Steve hurled the shield. It wasn't a direct throw. It banked off the leg of a nearby ATTE walker and came at Anakin from his blind spot. Anakin had to twist mid-air, batting the shield away with a desperate parry. The shield clattered into the mud, and Steve was already charging, unarmed. "Enough." Anakin raised his hand. A wall of invisible force slammed into Steve. It was like being hit by a freight train. Steve flew backward, tumbling 10 feet through the mud before skidding to a halt. He coughed, the wind knocked out of him, but he scrambled up immediately, fists raised. Anakin stood there, hand outstretched, breathing hard. He hadn't used the Force to hurt him, just to stop him, but the fact that he had to use it was the admission of defeat. He couldn't beat Steve with just the blade. Silence reigned in the camp. The clones were staring, wide-eyed. A nat-born had just gone toe-to-toe with the hero with no fear and forced him to use his powers to reset the fight. Steve walked over and picked up his shield. He wiped the mud from the star. "That's a neat trick, Steve," said the captain, his voice steady, though his ribs ached. "But if you have to use magic to win a fist fight, you might want to work on your footwork." Anakin deactivated his saber. The hum died. He looked at the shield, seeing the scorch marks that were already fading as the metal cooled. He looked at Steve, really seeing him for the first time, not as a nuisance, but as a warrior. A slow, begrudging grin spread across Anakin's face. It was the smile of a man who had finally found someone who could keep up. "It's not magic, Captain," Anakin said, clipping the hilt back to his belt, "and your footwork isn't bad for a guy from the past." "I'm a quick learner," Steve replied, relaxing his stance. Obi-Wan stood up, clapping his hands slowly. "Well, now that we've established that Captain Rogers is durable, perhaps we can discuss the actual war. The Separatists are regrouping at the capital city." Anakin walked past Steve, clapping him on the shoulder, a little harder than necessary. "You take the left flank, Rogers. Since your shield can apparently stop a lightsaber, a few tank rounds should be no problem." "I'll handle it," Steve said. As the generals walked back to the holotable, Rex stepped up to Steve. The clone captain was looking at the shield with something approaching religious awe. "Sir," Sergeant Rex said, you blocked a lightsaber? I didn't think that was possible." "Anything's possible, Rex," Steve said, watching Anakin's retreating back. "But he's right about one thing. We're going to need more than a shield to win this war. We need to change how this army fights." Steve looked out at the rows of identical white armor, the men treating wounds, cleaning weapons, waiting for orders to march into the grinder. "Rex," Steve asked quietly, "does every clone have a name, or just the officers?" "We all have numbers, sir, but we give each other names. The Kaminoans don't use them." "Well, I'm not a Kaminoan," Steve said, his jaw setting. "Starting today, I want a name for every man in my detail. If they're going to fight for me, I'm going to know who they are." Rex straightened. A spark of fierce pride ignited in his eyes. "Yes, sir. I'll make the list myself." The hollow table hummed. casting a ghostly blue light over the grim faces gathered in the command tent. Outside, the rain had returned, drumming a relentless rhythm against the canvas. General Skywalker pointed to the holographic projection of the Separatist-held capital. It was a fortress of jagged spires and durasteel walls, nestled in a valley that offered only one approach, a kilometer-long causeway stripped of cover, lined with heavy repeating blasters. "The plan is a three-pronged assault," Anakin explained, tracing 3 lines up the suicide alley. "Obi-Wan and I will take the center with the ATTEs to draw fire. Rex, you and Cody will flank with the infantry battalions. We overwhelm their deflector shields with massed firepower." Steve Rogers studied the map, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He saw the red icons marking Separatist artillery emplacements. He saw the narrow choke points. "What are the projected casualties?" Steve asked quietly. Anakin hesitated, glancing at the clone commander, Cody. "Intelligence estimates 20 to 30%. Acceptable losses for a target of this strategic value." The tent went silent. 30%. That was nearly 1,000 men. "Acceptable to who?" Steve asked, his voice low but cutting through the hum of the generator. "To the Senate? To the Kaminoans?" "To the Republic," Obi-Wan said gently, though his eyes betrayed a weariness. "War is costly, Captain. We do not spend lives lightly, but we must spend them to win." Steve walked to the table. He didn't look at the generals. He looked at Rex and Cody. He saw the subtle tension in their shoulders, the resignation of men who knew they were walking into a meat grinder because they had been bred to do nothing else. "You're fighting a 21st century war with an 18th century tactics," Steve said, pointing at the causeway. "Marching in formation against plasma artillery, that's not a battle plan, that's an execution." "We have shields," Anakin countered, defensive. "Shields break, and when they do, your men are standing in the open. You're relying on armor and numbers. I rely on not getting hit." He tapped the map, highlighting the ruined industrial sector to the east of the causeway. "Here, the terrain is rough, collapsed buildings, subterranean tunnels. Walkers can't fit." "Exactly," Cody said, his voice modulated. "That's why we ruled it out. No heavy support." "You don't need walkers if you have mobility," Steve said. "Give me 2 companies. I'll take the 501st through the ruins. We move in fire teams, not battalions. 4-man squads, bounding overwatch. 1 team moves, 1 team suppresses. We stick to the shadows. We hit their artillery from the flank while they're watching your walkers." "That sector is crawling with commando droids," Rex warned. "It's a kill box for infantry." "Not if we move faster than they can track," Steve said. He looked at Rex. "You trust me?" Rex looked at the map, then at the acceptable losses figure. He looked at Steve, the man who had learned every trooper's name in his detachment within 6 hours. "I trust you, sir," Rex said. Anakin looked between them, sensing the shift in loyalty. It wasn't mutiny, it was inspiration. He sighed, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Fine. If you can silence those guns, Rogers, we'll hold the center. But if you get pinned down, we can't reach you." "We won't get pinned down," Steve promised. 2 hours later, the 501st was moving through the skeletal remains of the industrial sector. It was a different kind of warfare than the clones were used to. Usually, they marched. They stood shoulder to shoulder, pouring blue fire into the enemy until one side stopped moving. Today, they were ghosts. "Echo, 5s, take the high ground on that gantry," Steve whispered into his comms. "Jesse, suppress that heavy repeater on the count of 3. Go." Steve moved low, his shield paint dulled with mud to kill the reflection. He signaled with a closed fist. The squad behind him froze instantly. Ahead, a patrol of BX series commando droids was scanning the rubble. They were dangerous, fast, agile, lethal. "On my mark," Steve murmured. "Controlled bursts. Aim for the photoreceptors." He didn't yell, "Charge!" He didn't ignite a lightsaber to announce his presence. He threw the shield. It spun out of the gloom, silent and deadly. It struck the lead droid in the temple, crumpling its head. Before the clang even registered, the clones opened fire. Pew, pew, pew! 3 droids dropped, smoking holes in their chest plates. The clones didn't stand in the open. They fired from behind Duracrete pillars, popping out, shooting, and ducking back. Cover, concealment. "Move up, flank right," Steve ordered, catching his shield on the rebound. They advanced through the ruins like a single organism. When a heavy AAT tank rolled around a corner, its turret swiveling toward them, the clones didn't panic. They didn't wait for a Jedi to cut it in half. "Heavy armor, ion grenades," Steve barked. 3 troopers lobbed EMP grenades. The tank shuddered, its system seizing. "Hard case, up the middle, pop the hatch." The heavy weapons specialist scrabbled up the immobilized tank, ripped the hatch open, and dropped a thermal detonator inside. He rolled off just as the tank erupted from within. "Clear," Hardcase yelled. They reached the edge of the industrial sector. The Separatist artillery battery was below them, huge cannons pounding the causeway where Anakin and Obi-Wan were drawing fire. The droids were focused entirely on the Jedi's flashy distraction. Steve looked at his men. They weren't breathing hard. They weren't bleeding. They were focused, efficient, and alive. "All squads," Steve said, checking his wrist chrono. "Target the power cells on those cannons. Synchronized fire. 3, 2, 1, mark." 50 DC-15 rifles opened up simultaneously. The volley was devastating. The power cells on the artillery droids detonated, setting off a chain reaction that ripped through the emplacement. Massive explosions bloomed in the rain, silencing the guns that had been destined to kill 30% of the invasion force. Down on the causeway, Anakin Skywalker deflected a stray blaster bolt and looked up at the fireball on the ridge. "He actually did it," Anakin muttered, impressed by himself. "And ahead of schedule," Obi-Wan noted, slicing a B-1 droid in half. Perhaps there is merit in this tactical approach. Up on the ridge, Steve didn't celebrate. He was already scanning the next objective. "Check your ammo," Steve ordered. "Banks, get a head count." "All present and accounted for, Captain," Banks reported, his voice thick with disbelief. "Casualties 0. Minor injuries only." The clones looked at each other. 0 casualties in an assault on a fortified artillery position. It was unheard of. It defied the actuarial tables the Kaminoans had programmed into them. Rex walked up to Steve, removing his helmet. The rain matted his blonde hair, but his eyes were shining. "I've never seen an op go like that, sir. Usually we lose a few. It's just how it is." "Not anymore," Steve said, looking out over the city. "We don't spend lives, Rex. We save them. That's the job." Rex nodded slowly. For the first time, he wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was a man being led by someone who valued his breath as much as his blaster. "What's the next move, Captain?" Rex asked. Steve pointed his shield towards the central citadel, a towering spire where the Separatist command sat.
Coruscant was a jewel of durasteel and light, burning bright against the black void of space. To the casual observer, it was the pinnacle of civilization. To Captain Steve Rogers, staring out the viewport of the Republic shuttle, it looked like a cage. The transition from the mud-choked trenches of the Outer Rim to the sterile, climate-controlled luxury of the core worlds was jarring. Down there, men were dying in the rain. Up here, politicians were drinking wine in towers that scraped the stratosphere. "It's quite a view, isn't it?" Anakin Skywalker asked, stepping up beside him. The young general seemed more at ease here, the grime of war scrubbed away, his Jedi robes fresh and clean. "It's a lot of city," Steve said diplomatically. "Where are the parks, the green space?" "There's the artificial biodome on level 512, Anakin shrugged. "But Coruscant is the heart of the galaxy, Steve. This is what we're fighting to protect." Steve didn't answer immediately. He looked at the endless streams of speeder traffic, the massive holographic billboards advertising luxury goods and Senate campaigns. "Back home," Steve said quietly, "I saw cities like this in the newsreels. Berlin, Tokyo, great feats of engineering.
But the people inside, they stopped looking up. Anakin frowned, sensing the critique but not quite understanding the context. "The Chancellor is eager to meet you. Your tactical report from the refinery siege has been the talk of the Senate for 3 rotations. They're calling it the miracle at Sector 4. "It wasn't a miracle," Steve corrected, turning from the window. "It was good men doing their job without being treated like cannon fodder." The shuttle docked at the private landing platform of the Senate Executive Building. Red-robed royal guards stood like statues at the entrance, their pikes gleaming. Steve eyed them warily. He had an instinctive distrust of faceless guards, but followed the Jedi inside. Chancellor Palpatine's office was a study in crimson. The walls were a deep blood red, the statues vague and unsettlingly ancient. The man behind the desk, however, looked like a kindly grandfather. He stood as they entered, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Ah, the man of the hour." Palpatine's voice was rich, soothing, the voice of a seasoned orator. "Captain Rogers, welcome to Coruscant. General Skywalker has told me extraordinary things." "Mr. Chancellor," Steve nodded respectfully, though he didn't bow. "Just doing my duty, sir." "Modesty," Palpatine mused, walking around the desk to stand before them. "A rare virtue in these times. The Republic is in dire need of heroes, Captain. The Jedi, well, they are powerful, yes, but they are distant, monastic. The people need a symbol they can understand, a soldier." Steve felt a prickle on the back of his neck. It wasn't the Force. It was the familiarity of the pitch. He had heard it before, in a small recruitment tent in 1943. The star-spangled man with a plan. "I'm not a symbol, sir," Steve said evenly. "I'm just a captain." "But you could be so much more," Palpatine pressed, placing a hand on Steve's shoulder. The touch was cold. "Imagine it. Your face on the holonet, rallies on the core worlds. You could inspire billions to support the war effort. You represent the best of us. Humanity, resilience, strength." "And the clones?" Steve asked. The air in the room stilled. Palpatine's smile didn't waver, but his eyes, pale and watery, seemed to sharpen. "I beg your pardon?" "The clones," Steve repeated, his voice firm. "The men dying to keep the city safe. You want a symbol of humanity? Why not put Captain Rex on a poster? Or Cody? Why isn't there a clone representative in the Senate?" Anakin shifted uncomfortably. "Steve, the clones they serve the Republic. They don't have political aspirations." "They're men, Anakin," Steve said, not breaking eye contact with the Chancellor. "I've fought along them. They laugh, they bleed, they grieve. If they're fighting for this democracy, shouldn't they have a voice in it?" Palpatine withdrew his hand, folding his arms into his sleeves. The grandfatherly demeanor remained, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "A noble sentiment," Palpatine said softly, "but alas, complicated. The clones were created for a specific purpose. To burden them with politics would be cruel. We must ensure their stability, their obedience, for the greater good of peace." "Obedience," Steve echoed. "That's a dangerous word, Chancellor. In my experience, when leaders start talking about absolute obedience and stability over rights, people start losing their freedom." Palpatine chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You speak with the idealism of a simpler time, Captain, but we are at war. Sometimes liberties must be managed to ensure security." Steve's jaw set. He recognized the rhetoric. It wasn't German, but the accent of tyranny was universal. "I've seen where that road leads, sir," Steve said, his voice hard as vibranium, "and I don't walk it." He stepped back, nodding to Anakin. "If you'll excuse me, General, I'd like to return to my men. They're the only rallies I'm interested in." Steve turned and walked out. He didn't wait for dismissal. Anakin stood there, stunned by the blatant disrespect. "Chancellor, I apologize. He's from a different culture. He doesn't understand the complexities of—" No, my boy," Palpatine interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. He walked back to the window, staring out at the cityscape. "He understands perfectly. That is what makes him interesting." Palpatine watched Steve's reflection in the glass. He had expected a brute, a simple super soldier he could manipulate like a toy soldier. Instead, he found a man whose moral compass was so irritatingly fixed that it acted like a beacon, a man who questioned the nature of the army, a man who saw the clones as people, not products. That was dangerous. If the clones began to believe they were more than biological droids, if they began to demand rights, or worse, refuse orders, the entire grand plan, Order 66, everything, it could all unravel. He is a powerful asset, Palpatine murmured, but an uncontrolled asset is a liability. I can talk to him, Anakin offered. He respects strength. He just needs to see the bigger picture. Perhaps, Palpatine turned, his face shadowed. But keep a close eye on him, Anakin. Men with such rigid ideals often find themselves at odds with the necessities of ruling. I would hate for him to become an enemy of the state. Anakin frowned. He's a good man, Chancellor. So was Dooku once, Palpatine said softly. Outside on the landing platform, Steve leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath of the filtered air. It tasted like metal. Rex was waiting by the shuttle, helmet tucked under his arm. He looked out of place among the velvet ropes and polished droid attendants. How did it go, sir? Rex asked. Did you get a medal? No, Steve said, pushing off the railing. I think I just made a politician very unhappy. Rex smirked. That's usually a sign you did something right, Captain. Steve looked at Rex, the scar on his chin, the weary set of his eyes. These men were the only thing in this galaxy that made sense to him. Rex, Steve said seriously, have you ever thought about what happens when the war is over? Rex blinked, taken aback. The war over? I don't know, sir. We were bred to fight. I suppose we'll just keep the peace. And if the peace doesn't need soldiers? Rex looked down at his armor. Then I guess we get decommissioned. Steve placed a hand on Rex's shoulder. Not if I have anything to say about it. Come on, let's get back to the ship. I need to get out of the city before I punch a senator. As they boarded the shuttle, a probe droid hovered silently in the distance, its red photoreceptor recording every movement, transmitting the data directly to a secure frequency in the industrial sector. Far away, in a darker, colder room, a holographic transmission flickered to life. The curved handle of a red lightsaber hung at the belt of the observer. The American, a deep, elegant voice said, "He is becoming a problem." "A problem," a mechanical, raspy voice replied, followed by a coughing Fed. "Or a trophy." "Deal with him, General," Count Dooku ordered. "Bring me his shield, and his head." General Grievous laughed, the sound like grinding gears. "It will be done, my lord."
The wetlands of Seleucami were a miserable place to fight a war. The air was thick with humidity that clung to the skin like a shroud, and the giant, bulbous plants cast long, distorted shadows in the twilight. Captain Steve Rogers crouched behind a fallen necrotic tree, his shield dulled with mud to kill the shine. Beside him, Captain Rex and a squad of ARC troopers checked their weapons with practiced silence. "Do you hear that?" Steve whispered, his enhanced hearing picking up a faint rhythmic thumping sound over the drone of the swamp insects. Rex tilted his helmet, amplifying the audio sensors. "Negative, sir. Scanners are clear. No droids." "It's not droids," Steve said, his eyes scanning the mist. "It's heavier, and it's wheezing." They were patrolling a sector where 3 recon squads had vanished in the last rotation. No distress calls, no bodies, just silence. The clones called it the ghost zone. Steve called it an ambush. Suddenly, a massive shape dropped from the canopy above, landing with a ground-shaking impact that sent mud spraying 10 feet into the air. Snap hiss, snap hiss, snap hiss, snap hiss. 4 distinct beams of plasma ignited, blue and green, cutting through the gloom. The light revealed a terrifying figure, a towering cyborg skeleton encased in white armor, a tattered cape billowing behind him, wielding 4 lightsabers in 4 mechanical arms. "Captain Rogers," the creature rasped, the voice grating like metal on bone. "I have added many lightsabers to my collection, but a vibranium shield? That will be a unique trophy." Steve stood up slowly, motioning for Rex and the squad to hold their fire. He recognized the archetype immediately. He had fought men who traded their humanity for power before. Johann Schmidt, Zola. "You must be the general everyone's afraid of," Steve said, stepping out from cover. "Grievous, right? You look worse than the last guy I fought who had a skull for a face." Grievous let out a guttural, coughing laugh. "Brave, or foolish. Count Dooku has placed a high bounty on your head, American. I intend to collect it." "You can try," Steve said, settling into a defensive stance. "But I don't give up the shield." Grievous lunged. He moved with a speed that was horrifying for a creature of his size. The 4 lightsabers spun like buzzsaws, creating a wall of death that chewed up the vegetation as he charged. Steve didn't retreat. He stepped forward. The first strike, a dual overhead chop, slammed into the shield.
Crack! The impact drove Steve's boots inches into the mud, but his arm didn't buckle. He gritted his teeth, feeling the raw mechanical strength of the cyborg pressing down. Grievous was stronger than Anakin, stronger than any human. "Is that all?" Grievous taunted, pushing down. "Not even close," Steve strained. He dropped his center of gravity and shoved upward with an explosive burst of power, breaking Grievous's leverage. As the general stumbled back, Steve spun, launching a roundhouse kick into the cyborg's midsection. His boot connected with durasteel plating, but the force was enough to knock the breath out of the organic lungs hidden inside. Grievous wheezed, stumbling back. "Open fire," Rex shouted. Blue bolts erupted from the tree line. The ARC troopers poured fire into the cyborg, aiming for his exposed joints. Grievous roared, spinning 2 of his lightsabers like propellers to deflect the blaster fire, while the other 2 slashed at Steve. Steve was in the eye of the storm. He ducked under a green blade that sheared the top off a nearby fungus, blocked a blue thrust with the edge of his shield, and used the momentum to slam the shield's rim into Grievous's knee joint. Crunch. "Grah!" Grievous snarled, his leg buckling. He lashed out with a metal claw, catching Steve in the chest. The impact sent Steve flying backward. He hit a tree with a sickening thud, the breath driven from him. His tactical vest was shredded, 3 distinct claw marks raking across the Kevlar weave, but the serum was already knitting the bruised tissue beneath. Steve scrambled up just as Grievous descended on him, all 4 blades raised for a killing stroke. There was no room to dodge. Steve threw the shield. It wasn't aimed at Grievous. It was aimed at the massive spore-filled pod hanging directly above the general's head. The shield sliced the vine. The pod, weighing nearly half a ton, plummeted. Grievous looked up a fraction of a second too late. The pod smashed into him, exploding in a cloud of choking, toxic yellow gas and heavy biomass. The general was pinned, his mechanical limbs flailing, his lightsaber scorching the ground. Steve caught his shield on the return arc and didn't hesitate. He charged into the gas. He held his breath. The serum allowed him to go minutes without oxygen if needed, and found Grievous trying to claw his way out from under the debris. Steve didn't fight fair. He wasn't a Jedi. He was a soldier. He jammed the edge of his shield into the gap in Grievous's chest plates, right where the organic heart beat behind the armor. He leaned his entire weight into it. "Tell Dooku," Steve growled, staring into the reptilian eyes behind the mask, "that I'm not some wizard you can hunt. I'm just a guy who doesn't like bullies." Grievous shrieked, a sound of genuine pain and rage. He abandoned his lightsabers, grabbing the shield with 2 hands and Steve's throat with the other 2. The mechanical grip was crushing. Steve's vision swam. He felt his windpipe straining. "I will," Grievous wheezed. "Crush you." Swip, swip, swip. 3 grappling cables wrapped around Grievous's arms. Rex, Echo, and Fives stood 10 yards away, their DC-17s holstered, straining against the cables attached to their utility belts. "Get off our captain!" Rex roared, digging his heels into the mud. The distraction broke Grievous's focus. Steve brought his knee up, smashing it into the general's faceplate. Metal dented. One of the photoreceptors flickered and died. Grievous released Steve, roaring in frustration. He slashed the cables with a retrieved lightsaber and scrambled backward, scuttling up the tree trunk like a demonic spider. "This is not over, Captain," Grievous hacked, his voice distorted by the damage to his mask. He vanished into the canopy, leaving a trail of oil and green blood. Steve fell to one knee, gasping for air, rubbing his bruised throat. The forest was silent again, save for the hum of the deactivated lightsabers lying in the mud. Rex was at his side in an instant. "Captain, you all right?" "I'm fine," Steve rasped, his voice hoarse. He looked at the 3 lightsabers gleaming in the muck. He left his toys. Rex looked at the weapons, then at the massive dent in the tree where Steve had been thrown. "Sir, that was General Grievous. He's killed dozens of Jedi. And you just beat him up?" "He relies on fear," Steve said, standing up and retrieving the lightsabers. He handed them to Rex. "And he relies on people playing by his rules. We don't play by his rules." Steve looked up at the canopy where the cyborg had fled. He felt a cold resolve settling in his gut. This wasn't just a war of armies. It was a war of monsters. And monsters don't stop until you put them down for good. "We need to move," Steve said, wiping the toxic spore dust from his shield. "If he's here, the main invasion force isn't far behind. And Rex? Sir?" "I'm fine," he rasped, his voice hoarse. He looked at the 3 lightsabers gleaming in the muck. He left his toys. Rex looked at the weapons, then at the massive dent in the tree where Steve had been thrown. "Sir, that was General Grievous. He's killed dozens of Jedi. And you just beat him up?" "He relies on fear," Steve said, standing up and retrieving the lightsabers. He handed them to Rex. "And he relies on people playing by his rules. We don't play by his rules." Steve looked up at the canopy where the cyborg had fled. He felt a cold resolve settling in his gut. This wasn't just a war of armies. It was a war of monsters. And monsters don't stop until you put them down for good. "We need to move," Steve said, wiping the toxic spore dust from his shield. "And Rex? Sir? Thanks for the assist." Rex tapped his chest plate, right over his heart. "We're brothers, sir. No one fights alone." Steve smiled, a genuine, wary smile. No one fights alone. He clipped the shield to his back. Let's go. We have a war to win.
The bridge of the Republic cruiser Resolute was a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Red alert klaxons blared, their frantic rhythm echoing the crimson flashes of incoming turbo laser fire that lit up the viewports. Outside, the Battle of Ryloth was turning into a rout. Separatist cruisers, sleek and predatory, had punched through the Republic's central formation, leaving a trail of shattered Venator-class destroyers in their wake. "Admiral, shield strength is at 20%, a clone officer shouted from the command pit. "We've lost the starboard hangars." Grand Admiral Will Huff Tarkin stood ramrod straight amidst the chaos, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was a mask of cold calculation, betraying no emotion as he watched the holographic display of his fleet crumbling. "General Skywalker is engaging the enemy flagship," a technician reported, "but he's outnumbered 3-1. "The general is a Jedi," Tarkin said, his voice as crisp and sterile as the air in an operating theater. "He understands the necessity of tactical sacrifice. Commander, what is the status of Ion Cannon 5? The comms officer grimaced. "Pinned down, sir. The droids have them surrounded. It's a full battalion. We can't break through to reinforce them." Ion Cannon 5 was the linchpin of the planetary defense. As long as it was operational, it could disable the Separatist command ship and give the Republic fleet a window to regroup. But the men defending it, a company from the 212, led by a young clone commander named Jet, were doomed. Steve Rogers stood near the holotable, listening. He had been brought to the bridge to offer tactical advice on the ground assault, but the battle had shifted to space so quickly that all plans were moved. He watched Tarkin's cold, analytical gaze sweep over the tactical display. "Commander Jet," Tarkin's voice boomed over the fleet-wide comms, cutting through the static. "Sir, we've sustained heavy casualties," came the strained reply. "The perimeter is breached. We can hold them for another 10 minutes, maybe 15. We need immediate evac." Tarkin's expression didn't change. "That will not be possible, Commander. Your orders are to hold your position at all costs. You are to deny the Separatist control of that cannon until the fleet has jumped to hyperspace. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken horror. Every clone on the bridge froze. They knew what that order meant. It wasn't a strategic hold, it was a death sentence. "Sir, yes, sir," Jet's voice finally came back, stripped of all hope. "For the Republic." The channel went dead. Steve stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "Admiral," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you just sentenced those men to death." Tarkin turned, his gaze dismissive. He looked at Steve not as a hero, but as a piece of unregistered military hardware. "I sentenced them to do their duty, Captain. Their sacrifice will save this fleet and 10,000 lives. A simple, brutal calculation." "There's nothing simple about it," Steve shot back. "They're not numbers on a spreadsheet. They're soldiers, and you don't leave soldiers behind. There's another way." He pointed to the holomap, indicating a series of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the ion cannon emplacement. "We can get a gunship in through the canyon cover, a small squad. Go in fast, extract the command crew, and overload the cannon's core on the way out. We save the men and deny the enemy the weapon." Tarkin scoffed, a rare crack in his icy demeanor. "A foolishly sentimental plan. The odds of a successful extraction are less than 17%. The risk of the gunship being shot down is over 80. I will not squander more resources on a lost cause. My decision is final." "You don't have the right to make that decision for them," Steve said, his voice rising. "I have the rank," Tarkin countered, stepping closer until he was inches from Steve's face. "You are a guest in this army, a useful anomaly, but you do not give orders and you do not question mine. Now stand down or I will have you confined to the brig for insubordination." He turned his back on Steve, a clear dismissal. "Helm, prepare for hyperspace jump on my mark." Steve stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the battle fading into a dull roar in his ears. He looked at the faces of the clone officers around him. He saw their helplessness, their ingrained obedience warring with the quiet agony of watching their brothers be thrown away. He made his choice. He turned and walked off the bridge. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He walked with a purpose that was more intimidating than any outburst. He found Rex in the auxiliary hangar, prepping the 501st for ground deployment that would never come. "Rex," Steve said, his voice grim, "get your best men, 5 of them. We're going on a little trip." Rex looked up, seeing the thunder in Steve's eyes. "Sir, Admiral Tarkin just issued a fleet-wide standby for retreat." "I heard him," Steve said, grabbing a spare blaster rifle from the rack and checking the charge. "And I'm ignoring him.
He's leaving Commander Jet and the 212 to die. I'm not. Rex's eyes widened. This was more than just questioning a Jedi's tactics. This was defying a direct order from the Grand Admiral. This was mutiny. He didn't hesitate for a second. Fives, Jesse, Kix, gear up, Rex barked. We're with the captain. A minute later, 7 men were sprinting toward a lat gunship. Steve was at the head, shield on his back, a grim determination set in his jaw. Pilot, I need you to fly us down to the surface, Steve said, climbing into the cockpit. Low altitude, follow the canyon trench to these coordinates. The clone pilot looked from Steve to Rex, his hands hovering over the controls. Sir, my orders are to remain on standby for evac. Steve leaned in, his blue eyes locking with the pilot's. Son, there are 50 men down there who are about to be executed by their own command. We're going to get them. Are you going to fly this bird, or do I have to? The pilot swallowed hard. He had heard the stories. The man who fought Grievous. The man who treated clones like brothers. He nodded once, his duty to his brothers overriding his programming. Yes, sir. Buckle up. The gunship detached from its mooring and dropped out of the hangar bay, diving into the chaos of the battle. It weaved through dogfighting starfighters and explosive flak, a lone transport on a mission of defiance. They skimmed the surface of Ryloth, the canyon walls a blur on either side. We're 20 seconds out, the pilot yelled over the comm. The whole area is a hot zone. I can't set down. You don't have to, Steve shouted back. Get us low and keep moving. The gunship swooped over the burning remains of the 212's position. The ion cannon was a wreck of twisted metal, surrounded by a swarming army of droids. On the platform, a handful of surviving clones were making their last stand, back to back. This is Rogers, Steve yelled into his helmet comm. Commander Jet, look up. The gunship's side door slid open. Steve stood on the edge, shield in hand. Grab on, he roared. He leapt. He landed in the center of the clone's position, his shield absorbing the impact. Let's go, boys. The bus is here. He threw his shield, taking out a line of B-2s, while Rex and the others laid down a storm of covering fire from the gunship. Hope, a concept they had abandoned minutes ago, flared in the eyes of the surviving 212 troopers. They scrambled for the gunship, grabbing onto the landing skids, the wings, anything they could. Steve was the last one. He grabbed Jet's outstretched hand, and they were pulled up into the troop bay just as a separatist tank fired a shell that obliterated the ion cannon in a blinding flash of light. As the gunship banked hard, climbing back toward the Resolute, Steve looked at the faces of the men he had pulled from the fire. They were bloody, battered, and exhausted. But they were alive. He had saved them. And he had just declared war on Wilhuff Tarkin.
The flight back to the Resolute was silent. The gunship's troop bay, usually a space of rough camaraderie, was as quiet as a tomb. The rescued men of the 212th sat slumped against the bulkheads, their armor scorched, their faces a mixture of profound gratitude and stark terror. Commander Jet stared at the floor, the adrenaline of the escape giving way to the cold dread of what came next. Rex, Fives, and Jesse stood by the open doors, their helmets on, their posture rigid. They had made their choice. Now came the reckoning. Steve Rogers stood at the front of the bay, his shield on his back. He didn't offer words of comfort. False hope was an insult to brave men. He had made a promise, not with words, but with action, and he would see it through to the end. The gunship slid into the main hangar of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The cavernous space, normally bustling with mechanics and pilots, was eerily still. Under the harsh white lights, 2 neat lines of soldiers were formed up, waiting for them. They weren't clones from the 501st or the 212th. Their armor was pristine white, accented with stark red markings. The Coruscant Guard, shock troopers, military police. At their head, standing with an unnerving stillness, was Admiral Tarkin. The gunship's ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Steve walked down it first, alone. He met Tarkin's gaze without flinching. Captain Rogers, Tarkin's voice was devoid of heat, a shard of ice. You are in violation of Articles 113.8 and 201.5 of the Republic Military Code, gross insubordination and the unauthorized deployment of Republic assets during a combat scenario. By my authority, you and your accomplices are under arrest. Rex and his men filed down the ramp, blasters held at a low ready, forming a protective semicircle behind Steve. The rescue 212th troopers followed, their movements hesitant. These men acted on my orders, Admiral, Steve said, his voice calm and clear, echoing in the hangar. They showed courage and loyalty. If you have a problem, you have it with me. Oh, I do, Captain, Tarkin replied. But discipline, like a disease, must be rooted out completely.
Commander Fox, he gestured to the shock trooper commander beside him. Disarm them. Use lethal force if they resist. The red-marked clones raised their DC-15A blaster rifles. The sound of 50 safeties clicking off was a single, sharp report. Steve didn't move. He didn't raise his shield. He simply stood his ground, a living barrier between Tarkin's law and his men's lives. You're not taking my men. That is not your decision. Hold on a minute. A new voice cut through the tension. Anakin Skywalker, with Obi-Wan Kenobi a few paces behind him, strode into the hangar, their robes swirling. Anakin's face was a thundercloud of conflict. Admiral, Anakin said, stopping between the two groups. What is the meaning of this? Captain Rogers just saved the lives of 50 Republic soldiers. He defied a direct order from a superior officer to do so, General Skywalker, Tarkin stated, his tone brooking no argument. He endangered a valuable piece of military hardware and compromised the fleet's escape vector. He chose 50 men over 10,000. It is an act of treason. It was an act of conscience, Steve countered, his voice ringing with conviction. An army that tells its soldiers their lives are acceptable losses has already lost the war. We are not a debating society, Captain, Tarkin sneered. We are an army, and an army is built on a single, unbreakable principle, obedience to the chain of command. No, Steve said, shaking his head. An army is built on trust. The men have to trust that the man next to them will cover them, and they have to trust that the man leading them values their lives. You ordered them to die for a hunk of metal. You broke that trust. He's right, a voice said. It was Commander Jed. He stepped forward, his face bruised but his eyes clear. We were prepared to die for the Republic, Admiral, but we weren't prepared to be thrown away. Tarkin's eyes narrowed to slits. Commander, you will return to your men and await court-martial. No, sir, Rex said, his voice firm. He took a step forward, aligning himself with Steve. Five then Jesse did the same. We stand with the captain. The hangar was a powder keg. On one side, Tarkin and the Coruscant Guard, representing the cold, hard letter of the law. On the other, Steve Rogers and his small band of loyal soldiers, representing the spirit of the men who fought the war. In the middle stood the Jedi. Tarkin, this is getting out of hand, Obi-Wan said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Let us handle this. A Jedi Council inquiry. The Jedi do not have jurisdiction over military insubordination, Tarkin cut him off. This is a matter for a military tribunal, and I am the ranking officer in the sector. He turned his venomous gaze back at Commander Fox. I am giving you a direct order, Commander. Arrest them. Commander Fox hesitated. He looked at Steve. He looked at Captain Rex, a legend among the clones. Now, Commander, Tarkin barked. The shock troopers raised their rifles higher, fingers tightening on the triggers. And then something incredible happened. Click, hiss. It started with one clone mechanic standing near a U-wing. He raised his blaster pistol. Then another and another. The pilots in the catwalks above. The infantrymen who he'd been watching from the bay entrances. The 212 survivors. And finally, the entire complement of the 501st Legion, who had silently filed into the hangar behind Anakin, emerged from the shadows. Hundreds of blue and white armored soldiers raised their weapons, but they weren't aiming at Steve Rogers. They were aiming at Admiral Tarkin and the Coruscant Guard. The hangar fell into a dead, profound silence. There was no shouting, no war cries, just the quiet, resolute threat of an entire legion choosing its leader. They had been bred for obedience, conditioned for compliance. But Steve Rogers had shown them something more powerful, respect. He had taught them that they were men, not units, and men choose who they follow. Tarkin's face went white with fury. He saw his authority, the very foundation of his worldview, dissolving before his eyes. This wasn't a mutiny of a few rogue soldiers. This was a schism. Anakin Skywalker stood frozen, his hand hovering over his lightsaber. He looked at the sea of clones, at Rex standing defiant, at Steve, the unshakable moral center of the storm. He had always fought for the clones, bled for them, but he had never inspired this. This was a loyalty that transcended rank and programming. The Force was a tidal wave of emotion in the room. Fear, anger, loyalty, confusion. But it couldn't solve this. Anakin couldn't mind trick a legion into standing down. Obi-Wan couldn't negotiate a crisis of faith. This was a moment beyond their power. Obi-Wan finally stepped forward, placing a hand on Tarkin's arm. The Admiral flinched as if touched by fire. Admiral, Obi-Wan said, his voice whispered, yet it carried across the hangar. Look around you. Whatever you believe is right, if you give that order, you will start a civil war right here on the ship. The battle against the Separatists will be the least of our concerns. Tarkin looked at the unwavering aim of the 501st. He looked at the cold fury in Rex's eyes. He looked at Steve Rogers, who hadn't moved a muscle, who had won this battle without throwing a single punch. With a barely audible snarl of pure hatred, Tarkin lowered his arm. Stand down, Fox. The shock troopers reluctantly lowered their rifles. The 501st did the same, though their stance remained wary. The standoff was over. Steve Rogers had broken the citadel of command. He had rescued his men not from droid or bounty hunters, but from the cold indifference of their own leaders, and in doing so, he had changed the Grand Army of the Republic forever.
The flight back to the Resolute was silent. The gunship's troop bay, usually a space of rough camaraderie, was as quiet as a tomb. The rescued men of the 212th sat slumped against the bulkheads, their armor scorched, their faces a mixture of profound gratitude and stark terror. Commander Jet stared at the floor, the adrenaline of the escape giving way to the cold dread of what came next. Rex, Fives, and Jesse stood by the open doors, their helmets on, their posture rigid. They had made their choice. Now came the reckoning. Steve Rogers stood at the front of the bay, his shield on his back. He didn't offer words of comfort. False hope was an insult to brave men. He had made a promise, not with words, but with action, and he would see it through to the end. The gunship slid into the main hangar of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. The cavernous space, normally bustling with mechanics and pilots, was eerily still. Under the harsh white lights, 2 neat lines of soldiers were formed up, waiting for them. They weren't clones from the 501st or the 212th. Their armor was pristine white, accented with stark red markings. The Coruscant Guard, shock troopers, military police. At their head, standing with an unnerving stillness, was Admiral Tarkin. The gunship's ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Steve walked down it first, alone. He met Tarkin's gaze without flinching. Captain Rogers. Tarkin's voice was devoid of heat, a shard of ice. You are in violation of Articles 113.8 and 201.5 of the Republic Military Code, gross insubordination and the unauthorized deployment of Republic assets during a combat scenario. By my authority, you and your accomplices are under arrest. Rex and his men filed down the ramp, blasters held at a low ready, forming a protective semicircle behind Steve. The rescue 212th troopers followed, their movements hesitant. These men acted on my orders, Admiral, Steve said, his voice calm and clear, echoing in the hangar. They showed courage and loyalty. If you have a problem, you have it with me. Oh, I do, Captain, Tarkin replied. But discipline, like a disease, must be rooted out completely. Commander Fox, he gestured to the shock trooper commander beside him. Disarm them. Use lethal force if they resist. The red-marked clones raised their DC-15A blaster rifles. The sound of 50 safeties clicking off was a single, sharp report. Steve didn't move. He didn't raise his shield. He simply stood his ground, a living barrier between Tarkin's law and his men's lives. You're not taking my men. That is not your decision. Hold on a minute. A new voice cut through the tension. Anakin Skywalker, with Obi-Wan Kenobi a few paces behind him, strode into the hangar, their robes swirling. Anakin's face was a thundercloud of conflict. Admiral, Anakin said, stopping between the two groups. What is the meaning of this? Captain Rogers just saved the lives of 50 Republic soldiers. He defied a direct order from a superior officer to do so, General Skywalker, Tarkin stated, his tone brooking no argument. He endangered a valuable piece of military hardware and compromised the fleet's escape vector. He chose 50 men over 10,000. It is an act of treason. It was an act of conscience, Steve countered, his voice ringing with conviction. An army that tells its soldiers their lives are acceptable losses has already lost the war. We are not a debating society, Captain, Tarkin sneered. We are an army, and an army is built on a single, unbreakable principle, obedience to the chain of command. No, Steve said, shaking his head. An army is built on trust. The men have to trust that the man next to them will cover them, and they have to trust that the man leading them values their lives. You ordered them to die for a hunk of metal. You broke that trust. He's right, a voice said. It was Commander Jed. He stepped forward, his face bruised but his eyes clear. We were prepared to die for the Republic, Admiral, but we weren't prepared to be thrown away. Tarkin's eyes narrowed to slits. Commander, you will return to your men and await court-martial. No, sir, Rex said, his voice firm. He took a step forward, aligning himself with Steve. Five and Jesse did the same. We stand with the captain. The hangar was a powder keg. On one side, Tarkin and the Coruscant Guard, representing the cold, hard letter of the law. On the other, Steve Rogers and his small band of loyal soldiers, representing the spirit of the men who fought the war. In the middle stood the Jedi. Tarkin, this is getting out of hand, Obi-Wan said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Let us handle this. A Jedi Council inquiry. The Jedi do not have jurisdiction over military insubordination, Tarkin cut him off. This is a matter for a military tribunal, and I am the ranking officer in the sector. He turned his venomous gaze back at Commander Fox.
I am giving you a direct order, Commander. Arrest them. Commander Fox hesitated. He looked at Steve. He looked at Captain Rex, a legend among the clones. Now, Commander, Tarkin barked. The shock troopers raised their rifles higher, fingers tightening on the triggers. And then something incredible happened. Click, hiss. It started with one clone mechanic standing near a U-wing. He raised his blaster pistol. Then another and another. The pilots in the catwalks above. The infantrymen who he'd been watching from the bay entrances. The 212 survivors. And finally, the entire complement of the 501st Legion, who had silently filed into the hangar behind Anakin, emerged from the shadows. Hundreds of blue and white armored soldiers raised their weapons, but they weren't aiming at Steve Rogers. They were aiming at Admiral Tarkin and the Coruscant Guard. The hangar fell into a dead, profound silence. There was no shouting, no war cries, just the quiet, resolute threat of an entire legion choosing its leader. They had been bred for obedience, conditioned for compliance. But Steve Rogers had shown them something more powerful: respect. He had taught them that they were men, not units, and men choose who they follow. Tarkin's face went white with fury. He saw his authority, the very foundation of his worldview, dissolving before his eyes. This wasn't a mutiny of a few rogue soldiers. This was a schism. Anakin Skywalker stood frozen, his hand hovering over his lightsaber. He looked at the sea of clones, at Rex standing defiant, at Steve, the unshakable moral center of the storm. He had always fought for the clones, bled for them, but he had never inspired this. This was a loyalty that transcended rank and programming. The Force was a tidal wave of emotion in the room. Fear, anger, loyalty, confusion. But it couldn't solve this. Anakin couldn't mind trick a legion into standing down. Obi-Wan couldn't negotiate a crisis of faith. This was a moment beyond their power. Obi-Wan finally stepped forward, placing a hand on Tarkin's arm. The Admiral flinched as if touched by fire. "Admiral," Obi-Wan said, his voice whispered, yet it carried across the hangar. "Look around you. Whatever you believe is right, if you give that order, you will start a civil war right here on the ship. The battle against the Separatists will be the least of our concerns." Tarkin looked at the unwavering aim of the 501st. He looked at the cold fury in Rex's eyes. He looked at Steve Rogers, who hadn't moved a muscle, who had won this battle without throwing a single punch. With a barely audible snarl of pure hatred, Tarkin lowered his arm. "Stand down, Fox." The shock troopers reluctantly lowered their rifles. The 501st did the same, though their stance remained wary. The standoff was over. Steve Rogers had broken the citadel of command. He had rescued his men not from droid bounty hunters, but from the cold indifference of their own leaders. And in doing so, he had changed the Grand Army of the Republic forever.
The aftermath of the hangar standoff was not a victory parade. It was a quiet revolution. Admiral Tarkin, seething but politically outmaneuvered, was recalled to Coruscant under the pretext of a strategic reassignment. The official report, sanitized by Obi-Wan Kenobi and submitted with the reluctant signature of Anakin Skywalker, cited a breakdown in communication during the Ryloth campaign. The 50 rescued clones of the 212th were folded into the 501st for reintegration, a move that both protected them from reprisal and reinforced the Legion's new, unspoken identity. No one was court-martialed, no one was executed, but nothing was the same. The change wasn't in the official chain of command. On paper, General Skywalker was still the leader of the 501st. The change was in the hearts of the men. It started with a single trooper in the barracks, a man named Glitch from Domino Squad. Using a small brush and a pot of white paint, he carefully stenciled a single 5-pointed star onto his shoulder pauldron. The next day, 10 more troopers had done the same. Within a week, the star had been joined by 2 parallel red stripes running down their helmets, bisecting the iconic blue tear markings of the 501st. The symbolism was unmistakable. They were still the Grand Army of the Republic, but their allegiance now had a new focal point. They weren't just fighting for a distant, faceless Senate anymore. They were fighting for the man who had faced down an admiral for them. They were Captain Rogers' men. Steve, for his part, never asked for this. He was uncomfortable with the hero worship, but he understood what it represented. It wasn't about him. It was about the idea he had awakened in them, self-worth. He accepted it, not as a symbol of his authority, but as a reminder of his responsibility. He moved out of the officers' quarters and bunked with the sergeants. He ate in the mess hall, listening to their stories. He trained with them, teaching them hand-to-hand combat techniques that didn't rely on blasters or the Force. He turned the 501st from a legion into a brotherhood. The Jedi Council was forced to address the anomaly. In a circular chamber high above the Coruscant cityscape, Steve Rogers stood before the holographic figures of Masters Yoda, Windu, and Plo Koon. Obi-Wan and Anakin were present, standing behind him in a show of uneasy solidarity.
A powerful influence you have become, Captain Rogers, Master Yoda said, his small head tilted. The clones, they follow you, trust you. A bond not forged in the Force, this is. They're good soldiers, Master Yoda, Steve replied respectfully. They just needed a leader who remembered they were men first. Your methods, while effective, are disruptive, Mace Windu stated, his voice stern. You have undermined the military command structure. Loyalty is a commendable trait, but blind loyalty to one man over the Republic is a path to schism. My men aren't blind, Master Windu, Steve countered, his tone firm but not disrespectful. They're seeing clearly for the first time. They see a system that treats them as expendable, and they're choosing to follow someone who believes they're not. I didn't create that loyalty. The flaws in your system did. Be that as it may, Plo Koon interjected, his voice resonating from behind his mask. We cannot have an independent faction operating within the Grand Army. It creates instability. We must formalize your position. I don't want a position, Steve said. I just want to help my men win this war and get home. Where is home, Captain? Yoda asked softly. The question hung in the air. Steve had no answer. He was a man out of time, and now a man out of place. His home was gone, and this galaxy was not his own. His purpose, for now, was here, with these men who had nothing but the war. In the end, a compromise was reached, brokered by Obi-Wan. Steve was given the official, newly created rank of Special Tactical Commander, a title vague enough to be meaningless, but official enough to grant him authority. He was assigned to the 501st as a permanent attachment under General Skywalker's command, but it was a formality. Everyone knew who the Legion truly answered to. On Coruscant, in his Crimson office, Chancellor Palpatine watched the reports with a predatory stillness. The Captain America problem had metastasized. He was no longer just a tactical asset. He was an ideological virus. He was teaching the clones to think for themselves, to value their own lives. A clone army with a sense of self-preservation was a flawed weapon. It would hesitate. It would question. It might even refuse a directive as monstrous as Order 66. Palpatine adjusting his robes, a cold smile touching his lips. Rogers was a piece on the board that did not conform to the rules. Such pieces had to be removed, but not by a droid general or a Sith apprentice. A symbol had to be brought down by a symbol. The righteous Captain Rogers had to be broken not by a villain, but by the very system he was trying to protect. Tarkin had failed through brute force. The next attempt would be more subtle. It would come from within. Back on the Resolute, Steve stood on the observation deck, watching the blue-white blur of hyperspace. Rex stood beside him, his helmet now adorned with the new markings. The men are calling themselves the Vanguard, Rex said quietly. First into the fight, last one out. Steve nodded, a faint smile on his face. It's a good name. It's more than a name, sir, Rex continued. It's a promise. We've been talking. When this war is over, we're not going back in our boxes. We're going to fight for a place in this galaxy. For rights, for a future. Because of you. Steve looked at the clone captain, at the fierce determination in his eyes. He had come to this galaxy by accident, a soldier lost in a war that wasn't his. He had sought to save a squad, then a company, then a legion. But now he realized he was fighting for something much bigger. He was fighting for the soul of an army. Whatever comes next, Rex, Steve said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. We face it together. The war was far from over. Dooku and Grievous were still out there. The true threat, the shadow that called himself Sidious, remained hidden, his plans disrupted but not defeated. The galaxy was still on fire. But now, in the heart of the Grand Army of the Republic, a new legend had been forged. It wasn't a legend of the Force, or of a prophesized chosen one. It was the legend of a captain and his brothers, a shield of hope against the coming darkness. Conclusion. Captain Steve Rogers' arrival in the galaxy did not merely alter a few battles, it fundamentally challenged the moral bedrock of the Republic's war effort. By treating the clone troopers as men worthy of dignity, he ignited a revolution of consciousness that spread from the 501st to legions across the Outer Rim. His leadership provided a new model, where victory was measured not in ground gained, but in lives saved. This ideological shift posed an existential threat to Darth Sidious's grand design, as an army that valued brotherhood over programming could never be the instrument of galactic betrayal he required. Though the immediate conflicts with the Separatists continued, a new, more dangerous war was brewing in the shadows. Palpatine, recognizing that Steve's integrity could not be corrupted or broken by conventional means, began weaving a more insidious trap, one designed to use the Republic's own laws and the Jedi's rigid dogma against him. Captain America had given the clones a voice and a sense of hope, forging them into a true fighting force. But as he stood with his new brothers, a shield against the endless droid armies, he remained unaware that the greatest threat was not the enemy in front of him, but the darkness lurking at the very heart of the Republic he had sworn to protect. His journey to save the soul of an army had only just begun. May the Force be with you. More stories await.